Right. Okay. So although that may have appeared to be a deviation from the EU and what its role is, it is really fundamentally important to understand the climate change debate in order to understand what the EU's role is going to be and has been in terms of the human rights context. So we need to look at that and how that is affected by climate change.
Well, absolutely. I mean, climate change is a human rights issue, in my opinion. The fact that the Earth is warmer by an average of 2 degrees centigrade or 4 degrees centigrade. The temperature here outside today has had a variance of 18 degrees centigrade today. Clearly 2 degrees centigrade isn't what kills you. Firstly, we're looking at averages, but also we're looking at how that affects the global. I think you made the comment that it's all global now. Yeah. It's all global now, and it's our effect on, and whether people are free, whether they have access to basic human rights, you know, of clean air, clean water, enough food, primary medical care, and a security from the environment. And I would argue, as an educator, obviously access to good quality education. So those factors are fundamental.
So in future there may be competition for the access to those things like land for food.
Well, if it's managed badly. I mean, the fact is, I've read papers that have a viable human population at 100 billion. Not at the moment we're at 7.3, and everyone's saying that 9 billion by 2050, maybe 10 billion by 2100, and that's bad. And in a current economic system, that would be bad. But I've seen options to.
So if you look at the EU in terms of what am I personally and my family going forward going to be able to eat for the next 30 years, am I better in or out, which will provide me with locally produced food or a means of delivering that food?
If I'm not mistaken, I think the UK imports upwards of 60% of our food in terms of calorie by calorie.
So that's a really interesting thing for people to look at if they think, oh, we're a self-sufficient nation.
Well, that's a long way from the truth.
It's a long way from the truth.
All you have to do is go into the supermarket and look at the production labels of fresh food, tinned food, dry goods, and you'll know that that's just not a credible statement.
My personal favourite statistic on this is that of the countries that registered deaths due to malnutrition, which is a desperately upsetting list to look at, 75% of them export food to the UK or Europe. That to me is a human rights issue that Europe perhaps could attempt to mitigate. That if we do import food from these kind of countries, maybe as a community we could make sure that people don't die of malnutrition first, in order for them to produce these cash crops, which we require them to do because they're so much in debt, which is a whole different kettle of bag of worms, or whatever cliche you want to use. But we are forcing the farmers to deliver this food, and the only way they can is by adding chemicals to their land, which is some of the most fertile land on the planet in Africa. I mean, we think of Africa as this sort of infertile desert, desertifying thing. For the most part, it is a grain basket of our planet, but we're forcing them to contaminate it so much so. And again, I've struggled to believe this is a fact.
Wipe out its fertility.
Well,
not just that, but the chemicals that they're using are affecting
the people
themselves
and the wider ecosystem. But the World Soil Association, and please everybody, you need to check this information yourself because this is very contentious, but the World Soil Association stated last year that the world has only 50, yes, 50 more harvests in the soil, and our soil becomes infertile at that point.
So how come how come people aren't hearing a lot about this?
The World Soil
And,
Association published that with a fist on a table, and the media didn't think, well, the media thought it was about as exciting as watching
so
paint dry.
voting whether to stay in or out of Europe could be neither here nor there compared with something like
Maybe,
that.
but Europe has
Sounds a
a
bit worrying.
really wide environmental boundaries within it between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. Food production could very easily be upped, and in a very sustainable fashion, within our borders.
So how could we, well, if you wanted to plan ahead, what would be the best way? Would it be to stay within a European group and plan ahead, or get out and
Well, I think we
plant
need
over
a,
every park in the UK?
well, only if you want to grow food based on the diet that we had in the medieval times, when we didn't have a global economy, where maybe you imported pepper and chilies, and they were precious things that you had at Easter and at Christmas. You know, and that was a difficult. And the rest of the time you ate turnips, and pretty much turnips.
And the way we treat the people who actually grow and cut and pack the crops
Now
that we're
Europe,
eating.
now to go back to Europe, Europe has the potential. We are, especially around the Mediterranean basin countries, we set the standard for food, I would argue.
Mhm.
You know, we have power. Now I cannot deny that Europe could make a big difference when it comes to food, when it
Food
comes to
stability
ethics
or
and global, but the two are interwoven.
Well, for example, tomatoes, they're grown in Spain.
So much so they have to dispose of them.
But not just that. The fact is, they have got labourers coming from Nigeria, I think,
That wouldn't surprise me.
and they are paid flompence, nothing,
Okay. Yeah.
nothing for it. They live in the most terrible conditions. Many of them are illegal immigrants, so they can't leave the country.
But that in itself is not an in-out question. That's one of, because the laws already exist to try and stop that.
Right, okay, but there are human rights about the way you treat your
Oh,
workers.
no, nobody says that. But what I'm saying is that the law already exists that should give every worker in the Europe a reasonable wage and a protection from risk and on all the
Yeah,
issues of employment.
Yeah,
But the fact that we don't do that in no way means that we should run away as a country. Perhaps we would do better trying to explain to the rest of Europe that a minimum wage, a livable wage, or whatever the term is this government
living
uses,
wage.
living wage, is something that can allow a viable economy to exist, even though we are seeing agricultural workers, agricultural companies complaining that they will be unviable, even looking after aged people saying that they are unviable in our new economy with a living wage now. So, but in Europe, if we pull it off, then maybe that would expand. Or will we have a living wage here in the UK and import cheap food from abroad, so because we don't care about what they do to their workers? But if we're in Europe, we could fight it. If we're outside of Europe, we just buy cheap tomatoes.
So if I was a young person thinking about Europe,
Okay.
where am I going to live? I'd love to grow organic vegetables.
Or eat
Can I
organic.
afford a house with a plot of land to grow my vegetables? Would being in the EU be more likely to deliver more affordable housing or not? It's
Wow.
interesting.
Yeah.
What would the planning systems be in or out of Europe? Am I likely to be more catered for as someone on a very low income in terms of housing development?
Well, on paper, the UK again sets the standard with regards to its build quality, with its building regulations, and in terms of its urban design, in regards to its planning infrastructure. On paper, Britain should be safe, self-sufficient, well-designed, dynamic, urbanly stable.
So the housing community in the UK has learnt a lot from European initiatives like co-housing, different models of construction, what are the other ones? Custom build,
Yes.
accessibility standards,
Modern methods of
etc.
construction,
Modern
factory
yes.
building.
So
Germany
it would be
invented these
interesting
standards.
to know if these things would still continue to be shared, and
Yeah, I wonder whether, yeah,
whether it's market-led or whether it's
are good ideas.
legislation-led.
I suppose it would be the ease of doing that. At the moment, on paper, again, it is very easy for a good idea in Europe to be used elsewhere in Europe. I think in practice, I see very little evidence of that. But just because it hasn't happened in the past, we have already made the point in our previous videos that Europe is becoming more dynamic. We would perhaps be more dynamic if we left Europe, but Europe in itself is becoming more dynamic. And that might be one possible future
So it would give us more room
scenario.
to be dynamic within it, because it is becoming more open
I think
to
that's
dynamic change, and it is having to respond to things that are occurring either within or just outside it, which is forcing it to make big decisions and not just sit there as a group of countries thinking nothing is ever going to change.
We've spoken very little about how this is going to affect disabled people.
so the human rights, the actual
Yeah.
pure human rights issues, disabled minorities, so economic minorities as well as cultural minorities. So to be devil's advocate, when we talk about the Human Rights Act that exists in Europe, which is there to protect all of these groups, evidence on the surface of one of the more easy to measure men and women is that since we introduced legislation of parity between men and women, very little change has occurred. That other cultural changes have achieved more
Disabled
parity.
people have benefited significantly through the Human Rights Act,
Okay.
and they've managed to get a number of changes brought about through the Human Rights Act. But for the Human Rights Act, they would still be in
Okay.
disadvantaged situations.
So firstly, will we, as soon as we leave the Human Rights Act, start picking on disabled people, which I would kind of question, but what would underpin their protection?
There would be very little, because if the Human Rights Act was dismantled, which
But could
if it was under a Conservative government, it is reasonable to assume that it will be dismantled piece by piece.
maybe the thing is to construct a Human Rights Act that fits people in the UK, and the people in the UK, I would argue, are some of the most broad-minded, open, caring individuals by the evidence that really is out there in terms of our acceptance of different cultures and I mean, wasn't it the UK who actually put the architecture in place for the European Human Rights Act? So, you know, even though it wasn't ours, but we
was back in the
just after World War
I think
II.
again it's down to people to think about yourself. So so you're walking along the street and all of a sudden you lose the ability to do that and put yourself in that situation. What sort of world would you be living in different scenarios? Would you be able to have accessible housing? Would you be able to have support and anti-discrimination legislation, get a job, have reasonable adjustments in your job? Obesity, diabetes, all these things are increasing. People will be affected by these issues and need these reasonable adjustments which someone has to pay for. So again, it's what would protect me more? Would it be in or out? Does that affect it, or is it something that is not affected by being in and out of the EU?
I suppose it's not, from my opinion, it would be what government is in power when the restructuring of the elements that we have left are in place. So in 2 years or beyond, you made the case in previous statements that it would is a minimum of 2 years and perhaps a lot longer than that.
So now we have a 5-year, do we have a 5-year window for elections? So there would be whichever party or coalition got in following the EU in or out would then have a run of time to do what it wanted with the legislation.
If we left Europe, my vote would be significantly affected by the proposed government or the proposals by parties as to what they are going to do with the opportunity now we have left Europe, and about creating that future scenario that you talked about.
So it would be good to ask people, what do you think the opportunities are? Because nobody's telling me
But we would have the
what
opportunity
these
though, wouldn't we?
opportunities are.
Whereas I don't think we would have very much the restructuring opportunity that we would have if we stay in. One of the perhaps positive things, and I'm really hypothesising here, that 2 years from now, after we've left Europe and the dust has settled and we understand the nature of the problem that we are facing, and only then I think will we truly understand that. The election that will follow that, let's hope those political parties will base their electioneering on how they will create a better UK.
Because I read in that report that it would cost a large proportion of the potential savings from leaving to actually reconfigure all the legislation and do the changes and consult on things and restructure it and re-vote and so that's an interesting one.
Oh
for
yeah,
me
I don't think we'll be massively in.
I won't
cash
suddenly have a
in
big
pocket.
pot of money to
There
spend.
won't be any money left over.
I think there's some debate there, and we can't.
So it's sort of
but yeah,
cash
it's not going to be a.
neutral. It's
maybe.
just opportunity.
It's just a case of I see it as it's just a case of being an opportunity, and it depends which way you want the wind to blow.
It's whether you want a dynamic, risky environment or a safe, predictable future based on current situation. I mean, we don't know that the European Union is going to be safe and predictable 5 years from now.
Which is an interesting.
I mean, is it safe and predictable now? Because you've got all the problems going on in Paris and in France and Belgium. Sorry, not in Germany and Belgium.
But Greece nearly collapsed economically if it wasn't part of the European Union. I think it's safe to say that Greece would have economically gone through a mill. It's bad now, but without Europe underpinning it, I think we would have seen significantly worse. So Europe certainly has acted as a very effective safety net for Europe, for Greece. And if you were looking at how to stop catastrophic economic activities, well, what better to look at than an economic structure such as the European Union? But for the wider issues, maybe there's some questions. Well, there are questions to be asked.
So it's whether you can use that basis to then build the wider issues from, or whether you want to leave and try and deal with the wider issues from outside. Interesting.
Right. Well, we've had quite an extensive chat about this report, the EU referendum and the UK environment, an expert review. I think the most important thing that's come out of it for me is to realise that if we want to be effective, we need to have that clarity of vision and purpose to know what we want and how we're going to get it.
So if you're trying to make such a big decision for yourself on which way to vote, it would be good to map out, to test the future that you would like, and then test it against the academic information that's on offer to see if your choice actually may give you that in the future, so at least you've made a reasoned decision.
To have that future that you want, that future can exist both inside and outside of Europe. All futures are possible. It doesn't depend. It doesn't depend on whether you choose in or out. It just might be easier if you're in or out. So as well as deciding which way you need to vote and which policies might give you the clue as to which you vote, I would also ask it for you to put a final column in that grid, that matrix that you might put together, and actually say, what must you do after the vote? What engagement must you initiate depending on the choice of the people in our country?
To make that positive change happen that you would like to see.
I don't believe this is an end. Please, you can't vote and then think that that's the decision. You have to then, this has to be a springboard, just like Wendy said, a springboard for our actions to create that future that you want.
because those issues that you're worried about now will still be there, and
In-
you now you
But
know
irrelevant to the choice of,
Yeah.
of in or out.
And not only that, they will be different, because although the situation may be there, it will have a different context, which will mean that the outcomes that you can hope to achieve from that situation are going to be different as well.
you may have to make different choices then.
Yeah.
and think
So that's what I
about
was meaning
what's
about
coming for
the
you.
column. So if out and you wanted that, if in and you still want that, you might have a different way of achieving it. But in some situations, in or out, it might require a very different action for you to become politically active, for you to do things, for you to, perish the thought, go on the street and with a placard or move, or even
Go to another country.
go to
Or
another.
come back from another country.
You know,
It's
there,
very
it does not end. Does not end with the decision, with the referendum.